Good evening. Welcome to Philip's 75th celebration. I am simply overwhelmed by the number of people I see out there. It's so gratifying. I'd like to welcome you all to the historical dialogue this evening. I have to explain the difference in terms. This idea was born about a year ago, and in the process of putting together a play, I discovered that most of the people that I was using as resource people had so much talent. How could a community theater improve on them? So they are going to tell their own stories this evening. It's warm, I know, but I don't have to explain to you. You grew up in Philip. There are some people and organizations that need thank yous. Frank Mason, who assisted me in this endeavor, the Philip School System for the use of the facility, the Philip Drama Club for their support, Mike Seeger for sound and taping. I'd like to borrow a line from Governor Janklow's letter that appears in Hawk and Horizons. History once gathered and recorded is the gift of ourselves to our children and to our children's children. I humbly offer a special thanks to all the participants that you see up front and a couple that aren't here for the gift of their history for us. Thank you. The participants this evening are Cahterine Griffith, Evelyn Haberly. Evelyn, by the way, is in authentic dress of the time. It's her mother's dress. Her hair is also done in the hairdo that her mother wore. Sadie Hoag, Claire Marie Husband, who's appearing in your mother's work dress? Grandmother's work dress. Her Sunday dress. That's a work dress. I guess so. Mabel Kiel, Maude, Bradley, Martin. I interviewed Johnny Burns, and so I will be relating his story to you this evening. Millard Carr, who has with him some football equipment. Frank Mason interviewed and will relate to you Dorothy's stories and Howard Kennedy.
I think it was a mistake on Nancy's part to ask a person to speak first whose memory goes back as far as mine. I will try to leave something for the rest of these people to talk about. I came to western South Dakota with my parents and older sister in 1903. We came across the river on the ferry, which was quite an experience for a little girl. Then we came west by wagon train, camping along the trail at night. Now, that is all I was really authorized to say right now. But when will I have the opportunity to talk to so many of you, to tell you what I really feel in my heart, my thankfulness for the years that I was privileged to spend working with the people in Hawken County. There are none finer.
I'm nervous. begin with, I'll tell you a little bit about me. My parents came out here to western South Dakota in 1906, bringing with them 3 small children, my brother Jerry, my sister Leota, and myself. We came to, like Cahterine did, as far as Pierre on the railroad. Then we had to cross on the ferry. The rest of the way we came on a covered wagon and settled out on the homestead. He was a frontiersman, an Indian scout, a statesman, a big rancher, a promoter, and a preserver of the buffalo. He had a big buffalo ranch this side of Fort Pierre, and at one time he had over 900 head of buffalo in his pasture. Our post office dates back to 16 years before 1907. In 1891, the post office was established on the 73 Ranch, a short distance east of Powell. The first postmaster was Dan Powell. He served until 1897, when the post office was moved to George Morrison homestead. Morrison then became the postmaster. In 1901, it was moved farther west to the Dr. Wyckoff place, about 2 miles east of what later became the town site of Philip. Dr. Wyckoff became the postmaster. Now his granddaughter is supposed to be in town for this celebration. I don't know if she is here tonight or not. Faye Eckerson. August 1907, the post office was moved into Philip. Mr. Pruitt was the first to anticipate a new town near the forks of Bad River. He headed west with his printing equipment and stopped at Dr. Wyckoff's place for the first issue of the Bad River News, which was our first paper, came off the press. Excuse me, I've got to have a drink. I don't know. 6 months later, he moved a half a mile west of the town site to await the town lot sale. There were a few other businessmen that began to gather in 1906 and early 1907. The first business was a store built of logs. It is built by Bob Brown and Fred Shoemaker, and it was built in the late 90s, and it was on the east side of North Fork, just west of town. It was the log building. It was later sold to R.M. Williams. The plotting of the town site was done by the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad engineers. On September 20th, 1906, the Western Town Lot Company was organized by the Chicago and Northwestern Rail Company and bought the major portion of the town site from a woman by the name of Myrtle Dupree. And the south side was bought from A.E. Morrison. In March 1907, a group of businessmen met in the McLean hardware store to discuss the building of a town. And it seems like the hardware store got to be the main meeting place. Early in May, a date was decided for the town lot sale. It was also agreed to work out a selection of town lots ahead of this sale to avoid bidding against each other. The sale was held May 9, 1907. Right after the sale, the race began to see who could get their buildings built first. The Bad River News won. On May 11th, 2 days after the town lot sale, the railroad came as far as Philip from the east There was a crew also working from the west, and they joined just out of town. August 15th, we had our first train. The train made its first passenger run from Fort Pierre to Rapid City. It had 4 coaches and carried 200 people. In 1914, Old Stanley County was divided into 3 counties, Hughes, Jackson, and Hawken. Fort Pierre, Kadoka, and Phillip were chosen as the county seats. October 6, 1920, we had the big disastrous fire in our downtown area. From the Farmers Co-op Creamery to the end of the block on the east side of the street, clear to the east end, where Henderson's, where Janie Kennedy has her store now, completely burned down. And on the west side, it is from bank to bank. It was a terrible disaster, but because of it, we now have a nice main street of brick buildings. We also, during the years, have had several bad floods. Today, the population of the town is 1,186 people. I have the history of the surrounding area and Phillip on display at the Senior Citizen Center on Main Street. I hope you all come in and look these pictures over. They were pictures that were taken by our father, G.M. Johnson, who at that time was a professional photographer. He traveled all over the country, sometimes on foot, sometimes on horseback. Sometimes people would come and get him, and he would stay for maybe a week or so. Now I'm going to tell you a few things that may surprise you. Excuse me. I told you I'm nervous. Now, my parents came from a town in the southeastern part of the state, Elk Point, South Dakota. And when he was out on the homestead, he started writing letters. They were very lengthy letters to the the editor of the Union County Herald of Elk Point, South Dakota. And he told in some of the letters about the life of the people, the homesteaders, around the Dead Bend area. I read a number of them, and they are very, very interesting. Some really surprising. Now this was taken from one of his letters. Phillip, yes, this is the town known all over as the best town between Pierre and Rapid City. It is only about 9 months old, and I will tell you what we have here to make the town a prosperous town. At this early age, we have, all right, I'll be in for a real surprise here. 2 banks, 1 butcher shop, 5 grocery stores, 5 restaurants, 2 hotels, 1 rooming house, 4 real estate offices, 1 United States Commissioner's office, 2 drugstores, 2 saloons, 6 lumber yards, 2 blacksmith shops, 2 livery barns, 1 lodging house and feed stable. And here you could get a room for 25 cents a night. The teams overnight, 50 cents, but the driver had free lodging. 2 barber shops, 1 tailor shop, 1 milliner store, 1 schoolhouse. There were 70 children in attendance. There were 3 churches, and there were more later on. 1 confectionery store, 2 hardware stores, 1 5 and 10 variety store, one large opera house, 2 feed stores, 1 furniture store, 1 bakery, 2 ice houses, 2 weekly newspapers. The Bad River News had just put in a new and up-to-date press with a gasoline engine. We had 1 depot, 1 large freight warehouse, 1 pumping station, 1 overhead coal chute and water tank, that is for the railroad, 1 railroad stockyards that held 1,000 head of cattle, 2 automobiles, 2 lawyers, 3 dray lines, 1 harness shop, 3 farm implement shops, 1 steam laundry, 1 telephone exchange with over 30 telephones in town, 3 doctors, 2 dentists that made regular trips here, a jewelry store, he said, which is almost ready, a double building, 48 by 60, that will be ready in less than 2 months, 1 room for furniture, the other for a general store, the upstairs for an opera house, and this opera house was, by the way, called the Grand Old Opera. In this opera house, they had home talent plays, dances, shows, many different types of school activities, and later they had basketball games. This is the largest town building in town and would be a credit to any town of its size or larger. Another building, 40 by 60, the lower floor for a warehouse, the upper floor Masonic Lodge rooms, 1 paint shop, 1 post office, 1 pool hall, 5 coal sheds, and I guess that was just about it. But I do want to say about a little bit about the pioneers that lived out around the Dead Man area. That most of these people came from very nice homes, had beautiful homes, and they came out and lived down the prairie. They lived in shacks, sod houses, or a bit of both. And I'm just wondering if any of us would give up what they gave up to live the way they lived. I don't believe so. Most of these shacks were about 14 by 14 or 12 by 15 and or 10 by 12. They all had 1 door and 2 or 3 small windows. Now, to add to this, there's one thing that I would like to say. That I think, and I think I'm right, there are only 3 people still living in Phillip that have lived here since the sale of the town lot and have lived here continuously and still living here. That is Hap Dorothy, Helen West, and myself. I thank you.
Did you know Phillip was such a big town 75 years ago? I didn't, with all those business places. Although I didn't come out here till the 1920s, so I'm not really a pioneer like Evelyn. But this incident I'm going to tell you about happened a couple of months before Harry and I were married. Out in our neighborhood, the neighbors all got together and rounded their cattle up to take to market. And there was Harry and his dad, and the old John Olsons, and Earl and Clyde Rundle, Morgan Smith, and then my brother George Britton rounded their cattle up and headed them for market. And on the last night of their drive, they bedded them down out a couple of miles north of Phillip so that they could take them into the stockyards early the next morning before too many people got to moving around. They're driving through town, put them in the stockyards, and then they were loaded on the trains, shipped out to market. And this morning when they moved into Phillip. They couldn't believe what they saw. The town was gone. It had burned in the night while they were out with their cattle. And only the 2 bank buildings were left. And I looked up the date of this, and it was October 6th, 1920. And 22 years later, Harry and I bought the Peter Mittner lumber yard, and we renamed it Phillip Lumber Company. And while we operated the yard, we sold material for or built over 30 houses in Phillip. So we helped to build part of it. I thank you, and I've sure enjoyed meeting so many people that I haven't seen for so long, and I hope to meet more of you. I know there's a lot of you out there that I haven't seen.
It's awful. Good evening. With this hat on, somebody told me that I should say, howdy! I hope I have it at the right angle. And I would like to tell you that this little Christian Dior outfit that I am wearing did belong to my grandmother, and it was her Sunday dress. And she wore it about 55, 60 years ago, something like that. Just for history's sake, I would say that Max and I came out here in October of 1941, and we opened the Phillip Bakery in October of 1941. I can't recall too many amusing things that happened at that time, because it seemed to me all we did was work. And in fact, all work and no play was what finally was the reason that we had to close the bakery. The doctor told Max that it was ruining his health. He worked from midnight until noon, 6 days a week, and I don't think we ever took a vacation. And the doctor told him he'd have to get out, and so on Christmas Eve of 1950, we closed the bakery. But we liked it so well here in Phillip, we didn't want to move away, and so we tried to think of some business we could get into that Phillip really needed, and we decided they needed a variety store. So we had the carpenters come in and remodel the building that we had, and we saved a third of the building for Furley Jewelers. He was in the same building with us. And we opened Husband's Variety in March of 1951. There were a lot of amusing things that happened on Main Street in the 35 years that I spent on Main Street. Some of them, it'd take too long to tell them all, and some of them I couldn't tell anyway. But I think I remembered a few that you might enjoy. I'm sure you all remember R.V. Milstead. He and Max were the best buddies for many, many years. And he was the postmaster here for I don't know how many years, umpteen years. And the post office at that time was right next door to our store. And one year we got in, at Christmas time, we got in all of our Christmas merchandise, toys and all. And there was one nice big box. And Max said, oh, that'd be just the thing for the Chamber of Commerce to use to put all their Christmas candy sacks in. They always sacked candy for the kids, you know, for Christmas time. So he said, I just think I'll take this over and give it to Millie. He was head of the Chamber of Commerce at that time. And he said he'd be happy to get this box. So he took it next door to the post office and took it inside. And I think R.V. had a bad day that day. And he took one look at this box and he said, what in the
is that box doing in here? And Max said, well, I brought it over to use to put the candy sacks in for the Christmas, to give out for Christmas to the kids. And Millie proceeded to tell him, he gave the box a kick and it went clear across the room, and he proceeded to tell Max what he could do with that box. It was not very complimentary. So Max swung on his heel and took off and took the box out and put it in the incinerator and burned it, and he was a little burned himself because he thought he was doing a good turn for Millie, and Millie didn't think so. So Max came back in the store, and he was saying some not too complimentary things about Millie and mumbling down in his beard, all day. And finally in the afternoon, Millie came over and he said, where's Max? And I said, he's around, I guess, because I was a little miffed myself. And Millie said, well, I want to see him. And I said, I guess he's out in the back room. So he went out in the back room and he went up to Max and he said, now, can we kiss and make up? If you remember Millie, you appreciate that. Another time, Max and Reckling worked all one day making the nicest little stool. They sanded it and varnished it, and they had put pretty carpet on the top and everything. The next day, they marched over to the bank and over to Greg Weber's office, and they went in and Greg said, what's with the stool? And Max and Al said, well, our knees are just getting so sore from kneeling down here in front of your office, in front of your desk, every time we want to borrow any money. We just thought we'd bring a stool and make it more comfortable. As some of you might remember Bill Dodge, who was manager of the Super Duper Market. It was located across the street it was located where Carly's food store is now. And that was right across the street from Bud Seeger's Gamble store. And the Gamble store was where, who's in there now? The Gingerbread Cafe. Anyway, they were right across the street from each other. And Bill Dodge was always pulling tricks, and of course, Bud Seeger was noted for his tricks. So they made quite a pair, and they had a thing going constantly. Bill would go over to the Gamble store and put signs. They changed the signs on the merchandise in their stores, And Bill would go over and he'd put free signs on the washers and dryers and things in the Gamble store, and then Bud would go over and he'd change the signs over at the grocery store. I remember one day he put a big sign on the bananas that said 5 cents a pound, 1 hour only, and boy, they sold bananas so you can't believe it. Then one year, that went on all the time. They were at each other constantly. And one year at Christmas time, Dodge sold a lot of Christmas trees, just like they do at the grocery stores. And he had them all lined up on the south side of his grocery store, and he very stupidly mentioned to Bud Seeger that they sure weren't selling very well. He was worried for fear he was going to end up with all these Christmas trees. And so Bud made a sign that says, Christmas trees, 69 cents while they last. Well, they didn't last very long. They went out just like that, And so Dodge was just so pleased to think that everybody was buying his Christmas trees. And then he went outside and he sees a sign out there. He'd been selling them all day for 69 cents. Oh, let's see, what else? When Basil Henderson bought the building on the corner where the career closet is now, he had it remodeled for his insurance agency, and he fixed it up real nice, and it was a really fancy building. he was real proud of it, and well that he should be. And but of course the merchants on Main Street couldn't let him get by with just having an open house, just a fancy open house. So they went over and they tied corn cobs and put them in the bash. I don't know whether Basil thought that was very funny or not, but all the business guys thought it was funny. Max and I had a really funny thing pulled on us too by our dear friends, I don't even know if they're here, Furley and Seifert. We had dual control electric blankets had just come out, and we thought, oh, I thought, boy, this is just for me, because I was always just freezing to death and Max was always too warm. And so we bought this electric blanket and we were telling everybody about it, and of course Furley and Seifert knew that we were getting it. And so this one night we got the blanket and put it on the bed, and this one night, oh, I was looking forward to a night, real cozy sleep night under one blanket instead of blankets this thick, you know, while Max laid there with his feet sticking out and trying to keep cool. And so we went home. We went to bed, and I turned up my side of the blanket and waited for it to get nice and warm, and it didn't. And I turned it up a little more, and it still didn't get warm. And Max keeps saying, boy, it sure is hot in here. I'm just freezing to death. And so that went on most of the night. In fact, I don't think I got hardly any sleep at all because I froze to death. And the next morning we went down to the store, and Furley and Seifert were waiting for us. And said, gee, how was it sleeping under the electric blanket? I said, boy, it's sure not for me. I was colder than I've been any other night, and I could see a sly little look in their eye. And come to find out, they had gone up the afternoon before and turned the blanket over. So if you turn the blanket over, the controls worked backwards. And as I would turn my side up and Max would get too warm, he'd turn his side down and I'd get colder. So that was not the nicest thing. I think we did something to them later too, but I'm really not going to tell what that was. Let's see. Oh, later, Bob Miller moved to town, you know. I'm sure a lot of you remember Bob. He was a young attorney, and he came here with great aspirations. He had big ideas. And he was also a practical joker, so he fit right in with Main Street in a big way. And I can remember some of the things that he and Charlie Ekstrum used to do, but I don't remember them all, and it's probably just as well. But I do remember one really funny thing. Bob decided to run for state's attorney. He thought that he was well qualified and that he would make a good state's attorney, and he was sure he would get elected. But all the men on Main Street proceeded to tell him that he was too young, too inexperienced, and too everything else that they could think of, because they were trying to talk him out of running for state's attorney, not because they didn't think he'd win, but they just didn't think that he ought to be quite so egotistical about how good he was. So anyway, they had Bob insisted that he was going to run, and he was going to win. So the men had the editor of the newspaper make up one edition, and the front page, the big headlines: Miller has decided not to run for state's attorney. And they made this one edition, and they put it on the desk in Miller's office. And you'd have thought Leo the lion had come out of his cage with all the noise that came out of Miller's office when he read that, when he saw that. And he finally did decide that it was funny, though. He liked practical jokes. There's one thing, though, that not really an amusing thing, but this is something that Leslie Henderson gave me this afternoon, and she thought that it would be nice if I would mention it because it was something that happened several years ago. There were for several years, there were local men here who had a very active whist team, and they played often and very well too. They traveled all around the country, played other teams, and they had whist tournaments and everything. And Leslie looked up the names of those men for me and gave this list to me. She said that when this whist group started, I guess the original men were Art Anderson, Thorvald Thorson, and Ned Browning. And surely there must have been a fourth to play whist. But anyway, then later on, they added to this list Jack Dean, and then of course Basil, Howard Kennedy, George Kennedy, Bob Coyle, Joe Coyle, Dr. Francis, Oscar Keller, Don Summers, Bill Johnson, Alton Ishaw, Ted Becker, and Paul Pierce. And like I said, they were a very active whist group, and I just thought I would mention that because it was something that went on in those days. I have to tell you too about Howard Kennedy. You know him as a level-headed, easygoing, quiet sort of a person, but he wasn't always like that. Howard always had trouble remembering where he put his car or what car he was driving. And one town, and when he came out of, I suppose it was Jerry's, it wasn't Jerry's then, but he came out of there and he looked around and he couldn't remember what car he had, but he knew he left the keys in it. And so he went to a car that looked like the one he had, and it had the keys in it, so he was sure that was the one he drove. So he drove it home and went to bed, and pretty soon the fellow that owned the car came out to get in his car, and it was gone. So he called the police and said that his car had been stolen. So the police drove all over town looking for this car, and finally found it out in front of Howard's house. Howard was in bed, sound asleep, happy as a lark, and they woke him up and reminded him that he had taken the wrong car. I think he still has trouble remembering what car he's driving. Now, you may not know who Oscar the Sly Fox is, but you can probably guess. That's Oscar Keller. This story is one of my very favorites. Furley's youngest son, Dan, was probably about 5 years old, and he was walking by a reckoning store one morning, and one of the big garbage cans that they keep down on Main Street was in front of Reckling store, and Dan noticed a sack in this garbage can. So he picked it up, and it had a bottle of whiskey in it. So he took it into Al's store and gave it to Al, and Al said, "Well, gosh, it isn't mine. You better take it up to your dad." So he took it up to Furley, and Furley said, well, it wasn't his. But he put it under the counter, and he thought, well, somebody will come along and, claim it after a while. And somebody did. Because in the meantime, Oscar stopped in at Al's store, and Al was telling him about Danny Furley finding this whiskey bottle in the garbage can. And Oscar said, we'll have to figure out how to get that. So he went up to Furley's, and he went in and he said, did Danny find a bottle, or did he find a sack in the garbage can with a whiskey bottle in it? And Glenn said, yeah. Well, he said, that's mine. He said, yesterday I was walking down the street and I had this bottle of whiskey in this sack, and I met the mayor and the minister, and I didn't want him to know what I had in the sack, so I just dished that in the garbage can. And Glenn said, well, that's fine. So he took the whiskey bottle out and he gave it to Oscar, Oscar said thanks, and Before he ever got out the door, Glenn says, "That sly old fox, he did it again." And he had. Let's see here. Oh, Max and Bob Miller had a feud going all the time. First one would be ahead and then the other. And then Bob was moved to Pier when he was made circuit judge over there. So he decided that he had to have a parting shot at Max before he left. Now, we'd had a well dug in our backyard, and Max and Lorne Pfeiffer had witched it. That was one thing that Max could do, and he was real proud of the fact that he could witch a well. And he and Lawrence Pfeiffer witched this well and dug it, and we got water, and we had a well. And Max was really proud of it. In fact, like they say that, like I said, he was like a kid with a new toy. In fact, they say the only difference between men and boys is the price of their toys. And this was not a cheap well. Anyway, he razzed Bob all the time about how much he had to pay for his water bill, while we weren't having to pay very much because we had a well. So before Bob left one night, he and Charlie Ekstrum and our son Tom, and I think probably anybody else that was loose around town, decided to fix the well for Tom, or for Max. And they had Larry Dice come down to the store in the middle of the night and get all the green coloring that he had, and they came up to the house and very cautiously poured it all down our well. So then the next morning, they had kind of second thoughts about the whole deal, and they were afraid maybe he might get mad about it. So they told me about it, and I thought it was really, really fun. And so the next morning, Max went out to water the tomatoes. He did that every morning. Whether they needed it or not, they got watered because he had a well. And here, pretty soon he came in the house and he said, "I wish you'd come out and look at this water. Sure looks fun." So I went out, and sure enough, water was bright green coming out of the well. I guess I started to laugh because it really was funny. And so I had to tell him what they'd done. And he really laughed too, because he always liked a good joke. And he said he thought it was really funny because he didn't mind anybody pulling jokes on him. He didn't mind anybody pulling a joke on him, especially if they were his friends. Thank you.
I would like to tell you about Philip as I remember it through. I am not a native of the town, but I was a homestead brat raised in Old Stanley County that in 1914 was divided to form Hawken and Jackson counties. The homestead was 8 miles south of Nolan, about 20 miles east of Philip, and where we got our mail and groceries. My parents immigrated from Nebraska in May of 1906 to Presho, where the Milwaukee Railroad was just completed. It was some 60 miles from the homestead. Lumber was scarce and expensive, so they made a dugout type of house on the south hill slope until lumber was secured to add to it. It was cool in the summer and warm in the winter. I lived there until 1936, when drought, depression, and grasshoppers forced me to seek employment elsewhere. Now, some 70 years later, Tom Odom, Keith Emerson, and John Kuchenbecker have built similar houses out near Lake Wagner, only on a more elaborate scale. So I guess history does repeat itself. What do you suppose the architecture will be 70 years from now? Nolan was an up-and-coming town around 1910 with 2 stores, hardware, livery stable, bank, and so forth. Liam Wheeler and E.K. Kishan ran the bank. A man by the name of Charlie Marden owned a grocery store where my folks traded, and he had a daughter named Grace, who was about my age, and we became good friends. She still has a cousin by the name of Ray Pellet who lives in the Midland and Nolan area. My brother, Harry Bradley, was the depot agent, and when we heard there was to be a 3-ring circus coming to Phillip, naturally we wanted to see it. There were 2 passenger trains on the Northwestern Railroad at that time. One went west around 4 a.m. and another one went east around midnight. So my brother secured railroad passes for we girls to get to Phillip. So the transportation problem was solved, and you better believe there were 2 happy girls that spent the day in Phillip at the circus. And need I add, 2 mighty tired kids when we reached Nolan that night too. In later years, Nolan had a big dance hall, and the trains were a convenient transportation for the young men and women to board the train at Phillip at midnight, and Powell was the next stop, and more young couples got on to come to the dance, which lasted all night, and they boarded the train at 4 a.m. to go back home. The Northwestern Railroad had dug an artesian well at Nolan and wanted to establish a roundhouse, as it was a halfway point between Pierre and Rapid City. Peter Jacobson owned the land, but he wouldn't sell to the railroad, and my brother said that he wouldn't stay because eventually Nolan would be just a whistle stop. So he left and went to Montana, where the big power plants were being built. In 1918, my brother Clarence Bradley returned from serving in the Army and got a job as a cook in a restaurant in Phillip and did night cop duty. The next year, he was elected mayor of Phillip. He was an avid baseball player, and along with Earl Dorothy, the Chevrolet dealer, and Paul Osborne, who in later years ran a hardware store for 37 years, Harry Swisher, grandfather of Dr. L.P. Swisher, Gib Fries, Harry Young, and others made up a fast team. He left Phillip in 21 to go to Nebraska, where he bought a restaurant at Alma and got married. My next train trip to Phillip in 1922 was with Martha Jewel Edwards, as she taught our school, and invited me to go with her to her home north of Phillip for Thanksgiving vacation. She was keeping company with Harold Ferguson, whom she later married, and he, along with Hartzell Olds, met the train in Harold's dad's car, and we started north. It had been snowing, and the roads were slippery and ice-packed, and the car slid into the ditch, and we couldn't push it out. So the boys walked to a nearby farmhouse and got the farmer to bring his team and pull us out. At the time, I didn't know who the man was, but later years found it was Les Baker's dad. The snow got so bad, Harold phoned his dad for him to come and get us. There was to be a big dance at Marietta, and we sure didn't want to miss that. Now, some 60 years later, Harold and Martha are still going strong as a dance team, and Hartzell is in the Phillip nursing home. Felix Burns was a native son of Phillip and making a name for himself as a boxer. And a bout was arranged between himself and someone from eastern South Dakota. At the time, I was being courted by a chap from the Phillip area, and he asked me to be his guest, and he got ringside seats. It was my first, the last, and only boxing match I ever attended. I never counted myself as a real fastidious person, but as the bout got underway and the punching became more violent, and blood began to flow from cut lips and noses, and the perspiration became pretty rank smelling, as I doubt baths and deodorants weren't used as frequently as they are today. and the boos and the cheers of the crowd. I decided that wasn't my type of sport. Felix won the match, and I won a fat headache. Philip had good county fairs at one time, and one year I remember a flyer gave rides for a certain fee. 2 couples of us dared each other to go for a ride. It was fine when we circled the town and then swung back over the cemetery. He either hit an air pocket, or I always believed he did it on purpose for a thrill, and the plane dropped quickly before gaining altitude again, and I've never been as scared in my life as I was then. And when he landed and I got out of the plane, my knees were just like rubber, and I couldn't stand up for a few minutes, and it took years before anyone could get me in a small plane again. Dr. Driver was the dentist for a long time, and later Dr. Francis, who retired in 1970. Dr. Jim Bloom from Rapid City came down a couple of days a week, and now he comes just on Tuesdays. 3 years ago, a young dentist from Platt, South Dakota, by the name of Thomas Diedrich, established a practice, so area residents should have their teeth well taken care of. I have patronized all 4 of them, and many changes in dentistry have taken place in my lifetime, with, I might add, plenty of improvements. In 1925, an up-and-coming business team by the name of Leon Wheeler and Ralph Milstead opened a business located in where the Pioneer Review now stands. It was a combination of insurance, real estate, and the agency for the Overland and Whippet cars. Wheeler knew my dad from bank days in Nolan, so they convinced him he needed a car, and I could teach him to drive because I had learned to do so from boyfriends with cars. It was a 4-cylinder Overland sedan with 3 doors. It was a pretty classy car then. My dad was quite elderly at the time, so we took the car out in our pasture for his first lesson. He got it started okay and managed to steer it. But then I said to him, "Now stop it." He pulled on the steering wheel and yelled, "Whoa, whoa!" But the Overland kept moving, so I finally shut off the ignition. Dad never did learn to drive, and the car never learned to stop on Hoag until the brakes were applied. Just to show how enterprising Wheeler and Milstead were, I was told that if the kids of Philip wanted to earn a fast dime, to go down to their place of business and offer to put their rear out the window and yell, "Whip it!" I can't prove that was so. Milstead later became postmaster and kept that position until he retired. In 1937 or 8, another 3-ring circus came to Philip, this time by a caravan of trucks, and needless to say, there were good crowds in attendance. They pitched their tents near where the sale barn is now. In 1940, I was elected clerk of courts of Jackson County, and in 1944, I married a farmer living west of Kadoka and south of Cottonwood. We bought a lot of cars from Dorothy Brothers and traded in the store, so when we sold the farm in 1966, we were no strangers to Philip. On the first day of March, we moved to a rented house owned by Haver Cross, which was later sold to the First National Bank. The house was moved out, and the lot was made into a parking lot for the bank. There was a 3-day blizzard that almost paralyzed Philip, but later in the year, the Philip Scotties went to the state tournament. They had won the district. I like it here in Philip, and I probably will live out the rest of my life here. Thank you.
I bet you thought you were through with me. Nancy pulled a fast one on me. I told a story to her the other day on the way to Rapid City, and I noticed that's what she has me down for here. So I think maybe I better tell her I'm going to be in the doghouse. How many teachers do we have in the audience this evening? Former teachers or teachers? Quite a few. When I was in the first grade, we had a teacher that we all loved. She was a wonderful person, very sweet, and she loved us all. Well, there was a man came into town. He lived here, but he met her. Her name was Miss Benster. And this man was named Mr. Michaels, father of George Michaels. One day, we were told that they were going to get married, and they did. We were furious. We hated that man. To think that he would come and take our nice teacher away from us. But they did get married. They hired another teacher whose name was Miss Rudolph. We hated her. She was a horrible person. I'm not so sure, but we weren't too nice either to her. But we had one girl in our school who must have been, I can't remember that she was awfully bad, but she must have been. She really made life miserable for this poor teacher. So one day, the teacher could stand it no longer. She got up. By the way, our schoolhouse stood where the courthouse stands today. It is one small, one-story building. It was warm weather. The windows were open. The girl's name was Beatrice Paddock. So the teacher stood as long as she could. She picked that girl up and threw her out of the window. I can still see her feet going out that window. Now, this story has been questioned several times. So when there was one of my classmates who came back to visit several years ago, I said to her, "Faye, do you remember what happened to Beatrice Paddock?" She said, "I can still see her feet going through that window."
When it comes to school memories, you're going to have to stop me. There was too many things involved in school, and so many things that one as an individual can't get too personal about. But some of the things that I remember most of about school was the changing in the schools from the time I started in 1921. In the heydays of the grades, having 2 classes in one room, 8 rooms and 2 paths, which was changed, I believe, in 1927 and 28. And then getting into high school. I remember in 1928 when the 7th and 8th grade were fortunate enough to get into the building which still remains on the south side of this fine addition here. I wish we'd had a place like this to play basketball when we were in school back in the 30s. I remember freshman initiation. Freshman initiation back in those days was the boys cleaning up the football field, which was approximately located here where we are now. Picking the cactus and the glass and other debris off of the field. Couldn't get all the stones, but you get most of the big ones. The freshmen had a lot of fun doing that, and they also went out for football. The reason the freshmen went out for football, irregardless of their weight and size, if you didn't go out for football, you had to take the exercise class that they had after school in the afternoons. So just about everybody went out for football. Another thing that impressed me in school was, or I think about, didn't impress me, what I think about in school is the number of cars that are parked at our school lot today compared to ones that were parked at the schools up through the 30s. Numbers were teachers, professors, and very few others. Some of the students drove from home within 6-8 miles of town. In fact, I recall that Bay boys who lived west of town here didn't get in early enough in the morning to run their taxi, but noon hour, they ran their taxi service from downtown back to the schoolhouse several times a day, or several times during noon hour. I also remember when my father would let us boys drive from the station to the home and back to school so that we could all crowd our lunch hour in 1 hour, which didn't work because Mr. Titus just practically refused to give us a tardy absence for not being able to have 2 persons eat lunch within an hour's time. That isn't all. After I borrowed the car one time, my father grounded me. No more driving the car from the station home to lunch and then back over to school. But there were very few cars parked along our school in them days compared to what we see today. And I think of all the children that go to school in Phillip today, what the dormitories and private homes would look like and what winter would be in Phillip with that many children staying in our community night after night with the exception of weekends. I can't go through school without telling you about turkey days. Turkey days back in the 30s, they dropped turkeys out of an airplane around Thanksgiving time. And one time I recall a bunch of the boys on the athletic team caught some of these turkeys and went up in the housetops and got them, brought them down. And that started our first athletic banquets. We got our mothers to fix these turkeys and serve them, and they served them in the Presbyterian church basement. So we started having the annual athletic banquets. To get into sports, that's kind of a rough one because I was not about sports, but not so hot in my school or other school activities. I remember a joke in the book. Mr. Henriksen asked Ben Carr how I was doing in school. Well, he says he's way back in his studies and half back on the football team. But taking nothing from sports and athletics, I can't help but share with you the difference between football, basketball, and track in our time compared to what we are entitled to and enjoy today. Football has so many rules changed that we won't go into that. However, I remember one instance where forward motion did not make a dead ball. We were playing the Pure Indians, and so help me if I get these names right. I can be called by being mistaken, but if I remember correctly, Dude, or Russell Fairchild, and Ed Hansen put their shoulders to an Indian when we played the Pure Indians and just about drove him back to his goal line before he fell to his knees. And that's where we took over the football and went on then to beat the Indians 13-0. Another thing I'd like to note here is that the Indian teams did not belong to the South Dakota High School Athletic Association, and you should have seen some of the monsters and the numbers of those fellas that came after us on the football field. You can't say athletics without talking about Polly's Hall. Polly's Hall is an place of activities. Everything from boxing, court sessions, dances. I remember them setting radios up in Polly's Hall during the World Series. It's just like when television came out, we ran over to our neighbors to watch TV. Gentlemen in town would collect at the radio in Polly's Hall. We also had roller skating up there. I remember in 1932 when the South Dakota Highway Athletic Association says that baskets must be 10 feet off of the playing floor. And Mr. Polly's Hall did not comply with that regulation. For a while we were really worried about whether we were going to have a 32 basketball season or not, but Mr. Polly, he raised those ceilings at the end of the floor in order for the high school to comply with the South Dakota High School Athletic Association rules. Well, another thing I must note here is in track, the javelin throw was injuring so many athletes who were carelessly walking in front of him. Couldn't blame the thrower. But anyway, they ruled out the javelin throw and put in the football throw for the javelin in high school. That didn't affect the colleges, however. Then I noticed today there's no such thing as a football throw neither. But the biggest and the best thing I like about the athletic program in Phillip is the changes that's been made in the lighted field and the grass and everything out here at the fairgrounds. That's been through city and community cooperation. And it's been great to come up in a community like Philip and the changes in the educational department. Another thing I must want to mention, and this is controversial, for I have not been able to make facts out of it, but looking back as well as I can, Fort Pierre and Philip both claimed the buffalo as a mascot. And I do know that the high school class range up through 31 had the buffalo as a mascot in the ring. And I've tried to pin Bobby Hansen down to having, oh, excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. Bobby Hansen to join Scotty Pup for the Philip mascot after Philip conceded the discussion to Fort Pierre to let themselves be called the Buffaloes, and we would take on the Scotty Dog in order to name the Scotty Phillips athletic team. And in closing about athletics, one could go into the program of equipment. This here is a 1932 football helmet. We had the privilege of using what this high school would furnish us in the way of suits. I can remember when the coaches and Mr. Henriksen would raise a good number of trousers, shoulder pads, socks, and so forth. And the school bought the right colored jerseys, and they were new. But shoes too were furnished if they fit you. If you find a pair that fit you good, if you didn't like them, you bought your own shoes. But this football helmet belonged to Jim Braddock. Jim Braddock, and I must divulge on this a little bit. Another thing about athletics program in them years, your parents or some sport-minded individual done all the transportation of the athletes from one town to another. And Jimmy Braddock chose to buy this football helmet, and he kept it. Some of us, when football season was over, handed down to a younger brother or sold ours to another individual. The reason I have this helmet is because Jimmy Braddock in April in 1934 gave up his high school education, or chose to give up his high school education to go to Coyne Electric School in Chicago, Illinois in 1934 in April. Jimmy Braddock met his death in a bus accident on May 30th the same year. Braddock's car, when Jim was in school, and Margaret, his sister Margaret Braddock Durnell, every football, every basketball trip, every skip day, you could bank on Braddock's furnishing the car. And I know it's loathsome to point out any individual because there have been so many that we think of, but we would like to pay tribute to Jimmy Braddock in memory of him and many others who have gone on before that aren't here today to enjoy this here Jubilee with us, and especially this class reunion. You and I both can't count on our fingers or toes, the number of those people. But in passing remarks, I feel real proud that Margaret Braddock gave me this helmet. Thank you. I came to Philip in 1915, and I feel it a privilege to stand up here and say, I'm sure glad to see all you people here. I just checked with Mr. Seeger over here, and he says he still has plenty of tape.
About 5 hours.
However, you should have saw this pile of cards before the Pioneer Review special came out. So you're lucky. I would recommend, instead of having to go through all that I had written out and dreamed up the last few nights, that you get a copy of this Pioneer Review special and watch for the drummer and keep these publications to remind you in later years of all the good times that you're going to have around here today and tomorrow and the next day. Having lived here all of my life, I have chosen a few items to talk on, which I remember that have changed so much since I've grown up. And of course, one of the first things is the streets, the street lights, and law enforcement. Law enforcement. I can remember when I was a small boy and they held basketball games in Police Hall. My brother and 2 other boys from up on the hill took advantage of the halftime to go down to Dean Hockett's and get a drink of water at halftime. We hadn't heard the fire bell that Mr. Bill Burns rang every night at 9 o'clock, but we thought a basketball game be an exception. He stopped us on our way back to the Police Hall from Dean's and took us over and put us in jail. And when the ball game was over, he came back over and let us out, and he says, now you go home and tell your parents where you've been, and do not let me catch you on the streets after the curfews rang again. Now, I think we outlasted Bill Burns, but I remember Bill Burns as a street man and the marshal and a real gentleman. He built sidewalks in town with gravel, team and wagon, and the ways he went about things. And what I'd like to do is follow up through the streets that we have today compared to the ones we had then. I remember when I was a small boy, I could sit in front of Ed Flynn's barber shop on the board fence and my feet would barely touch the ground. And I've also remember my father saying, if they keep hauling gravel into these streets, they're going to be about as high as the sidewalks. And that was just about the truth. However, since then, and in the last 10 years, our streets have improved very much. And I'm sure you are all aware of that. And in law enforcement, us children had one good friend in Paul Radigan. We used to hex that poor man on Halloween. I don't know how he stood it. Paul finally got smart. He started throwing Halloween parties. He went around to the businessmen in town and threw these parties for these kids to keep them on the streets and in a nice way, and I'll go home and leave things alone. And that's what happened. Another time we ran follow the law when I was a boy was crawling up on the water tower, which was a no-no, and swinging off the flagpole rope. What happened that Mayor Benedict ran a cafe just down below the hill, and he always reported when he saw something like that going on up there, and we were always stopped. Street lights, I can remember when the street lights were so dim you could pull anything you wanted to and fill it. They would put the Christmas tree in the center of Oak Street and Central Avenue down here with a bulb about 300 watts, I imagine, and the lights would be strung onto the tree from that same lamp. In those days, that was very neat. But today, if you've ever been in Phillip around Christmas time, you've noticed the progress in both street lighting and our streets. When someone comes along and tells you that you must curb and gutter your sidewalk, that they're going to put in a blacktop street, you think twice. You think about the expense to yourself, and you think about how nice it's going to be not to have that dust flying around all the time. So, being property owners and such, we in Phillip, along with the council and the people that we have in Phillip now, you'll notice that stutter now. This reminds me of when Coach used to tell me, Carr, you can run crossways on that football field all afternoon and you'll never make a touchdown. And before I get through with the next item that is on the program for me, you'll know why Miss Lois Mullins thought I should take English 3 the second year.
I have heard that there is a lack in the records of graduating classes from 1912 to 1916. That doesn't really make too much difference. The students were there. There were students finishing the course each of those years. It is my pleasure to talk about some of the people in those classes. In the class of 1913, there were several. Earl Dorothy, which you know the Dorothy family very well. Magnus Kyde, whose father was a doctor. I have heard that his sister, Nita Kyde Brazel, is planned to come to this reunion from California. There was Juanita Lucas, whose father was a Methodist minister, a Stormo boy who was son of a Lutheran minister, and then there were others in that group also. Our teachers during the time that I was in school were Professor Rollinger and Miss Dunleavy. The class of 1914 is the one which I care the most about, naturally. There were 3 of us in that class. Minnie Jensen, a sister of Mary Thorson, and Grace Lindgren. Her daughter later graduated from the Phillip High School. Her name now, Mrs. Dorothy Rice. I'm sure she will be present. And then there was me, and I'm sure that you know all about me. George Enos went to the School of Mines from the Phillip School, graduated with a degree in metallurgical engineering. He received a scholarship to the Institute of Technology in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He received his PhD degree in Cincinnati. He was in the Army, reached the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. At the time of his death, about age 60, he had been called to the professorship in Purdue at Lafayette, Indiana, as head of his department. Well, I was here in 1914, of course, when the schoolhouse burned. We went down to a frame building where the courthouse now is. Of course, we had no furniture, but the high school boys were very good at finding little tables. Since the tables were theirs, they had the privilege of choosing the girl who sat at their table. I have been invited to class reunions of 1938 and 1939 at different times. My son's class was 1939, and he had some very good friends in the classes of 1938 also. I also attended the class reunion for the class of 1920. They invited those who had been in school prior to that time to join them. Mary Thorson represented the class of 1912, and Cahterine Griffith the class of 1914. This afternoon, I met a resident of your town. He said to me, "I was a pupil of yours in the 2nd grade." And I said, "I'm very proud of you. I'm proud of all those boys and girls who grew up, now have families of their own, and are holding positions in their community." It is a pleasure to be at this reunion. It is certainly the largest, and what fun we are having meeting each other.
Clara Marie, you didn't tell all that story right. You know, she said that car that I took, it just happened that I'd sold those people the same colored car that I was driving, and that was the only reason I got in the wrong car. Well, that's my wife again. Well, I don't know whether you know it, but I was born in Philip, South Dakota. And I'm sure that probably there's a number of people who would know where Mrs. Allen's maternity home was. Somebody should know that. It was up on top of the hill, a little white house somewhere there. That's what my dad told me. And the guy that brought my mother to town was Bert Humbert, because he was about the only one in our community that had an automobile. And so my dad had him bring my mother to town, and Dr. Gerhardt was the doctor. I always think of my mother. She worked for her mother, for her dad, and his brother in Cottonwood, South Dakota. And they owned a store there, and they bought cream. And of course, my mother was a very lenient person, and of course, she tested the cream, and of course, the cream was tested pretty high, and they shipped it back to Minneapolis. And finally, the people that was buying the cream called back and told them, "Please stop her, because she'll break the Bank of London." Now, one other thing that happened in my life, I remember that when I was a young fellow, there was another dealership besides the Dorothy brothers in town. That was the Wheeler Milstead Agency. And I remember my dad buying an automobile from him. Willis Knight, whether you ever heard of that before, but that was what he bought. I don't think very many people bought it, but that's what he bought. And anyway, my granddad was here from my mother's side. The granddad was here from Canada, and he had never driven an automobile. And I remember we were living out at Grindstone. It was right west of where the store also and the hall is. And we were milking cows. Duck and I were milking the cows, and we saw coming down the road there my dad and my granddad. They were in this automobile. And as they come down the hill, they got down that old Pino creek where the crossing is, where the bridge is, and they disappeared. And after a little while, we got concerned about it, and pretty soon we saw two guys walking up the road. And so we immediately went down thinking, didn't know what had happened to them. Of course, we knew something had happened. But I never will forget my granddad telling us, he said, you know, I just turned out for the bridge, because he had never driven a car in his life, and my dad was just trying to help him. I mean, let him try to drive one. I don't know whether you people remember, but on these roads in South Dakota, the county roads that we had, a lot of those were started by horse. That is, they got 4-horse teams, and they had Fresnos, that's what they built these roads with. And I can remember, as I was a little guy, just south of where Eads lived now, we lived on that place right there. And I remember my dad as a little guy, I was a little guy, and my dad was getting these horses ready to go. They were 4-horse teams. And at that time, that was one of the big ways that they built the roads. Now, I don't know whether you people remember, but I don't know who was the supervisor or who was the foreman, but anyway, Earl Rouse, that was my uncle, he was one of the other, and Lou Carr was the other man. So I don't know, but I just want you to remember that they were some of the people that started these roads in Hawken County. I have one thing that's very close to me, and that's the Philip Lighted Field. I was president of that organization all through till we turned it over to the other organization. And it wasn't because of me, it was of all these fine people that were in this community, and all of these people that were directors to this. But we had one thing when we built this thing, and we were proud of that thing, was when we went out and solicited the money, we said we were going to pay it back. And that's one of the things that we did in the end. We paid every nickel back that we took from anybody by taking the money that we took in and returning it. Now those people on that board, there were a number of them. There was Basil Henderson, there was Charlie West, Bud Seeger, there was R.V. Milstead, Paul Osborne, Dr. Francis, Dean Hockett, Marvin Brooks, and Archie McKay. And not only that, but we had a number of other people that worked real hard to try to provide that. And that's one of the things that all of us on that board were very proud of, because I don't think there's very many communities can say that when you went out and get it, you didn't pay it all back. I went to school in Cottonwood. I graduated from there, and I was proud of graduating there. My brother and I both did. Duck and I both graduated from there. And I can always think of the first district tournament. We didn't have a hall, but we practiced outside. That was the only place we had. And the first tournament we went to was to Midland. But we had to go through Phillip, and we had to go on the train. And you know, at the same time, the hotel down there is the same one that's there then, because I was in the other while back, and it's pretty near the same similar thing. You could take a shower if you wanted to in the water, or whatever it was. I have a couple things that I think of farming. One thing I think of farming, and I'm close to that because I've been in the implement business in Philip, South Dakota for 38 years, and it's been good to me. And I think of the things that have changed, but I want to think of you people to remember is that there's two people that stand out in my mind that have changed the farming in Hawken County more than anybody else. And that was one gentleman in Milesville, and that was Roy Trenchard. and the other person was Martin Agan in Grindstone, South Dakota. Now, I can remember as a young man when he started out, he started to strip farm, and he planted it every other year. And I think most everybody in our community thought he was crazy. But you know, it was funny back in those years, he was about the only guy that raised a crop. And finally, it turned the whole thing around, and that's why our economy is probably a lot better than it ever was. But I can lay that to two gentlemen that I think that started, and there are probably others that did it. I know it's been a long while, but I have just I have one thing, or a couple things that I coached here, and I taught school. My brother taught school here, and coached here, and we were proud of what they stood for, what the athletic program was here, what the young people that we were in contact with, and the closeness that we had, and the closeness that we've always had with those people. They have been wonderful people, and I know these other people have been the same way. I want to remark about one thing, is in closing, I always think of Marvin and Alice Brooks. And you all, I'm sure most of you people all know them. Well, you know, they went to the state fair. And of course, at that time, you know, they had these crepe dresses, you know, that, I don't know what you would call them. What did you say, Dorothy? Something like permanent shrink or something like that. But anyway, they went to the state fair, and of course, Marvin and Alice was there, and they didn't have any umbrella or anything, but it started to rain. And there was poor Marvin and Alice, and not underneath the umbrella or anything, or underneath that roof, you know, that was on the outside, and poor Alice's dress started to shrink. And you can't imagine, they say, how poor Marvin hovered over her trying to get her out of there so that it would be not a spectacle. I want to thank you for everything.
I have the privilege of speaking for Hap Dorothy. Hap is the native of Phillip, and he was unable to be here tonight, but he graduated from Phillip High School in 1918. And being a lifelong resident of Phillip, as Evelyn was saying, well, he has many experiences, and time doesn't permit me to go into all of them that he told me, between he and his wife, but I'll pick out a few of the highlights. One of the things that he remembers specifically was the funniest thing he ever saw in Phillip, in Hap's opinion anyway, was in 1928. A very colorful character named Malachi Foley, who lived in Phillip. As I say, I didn't know the gentleman. He's quite a while before my time, but Hap says he was just crazy. He'd do the darndest things, and they're all funny. I mean, he was just in good fun, but he just did an awful lot of wild things. But apparently, one that he thought was the funniest thing Malachi ever did was he had bought a new car, the first car he'd ever owned. This was in 1928. And he was going to go to the Winchester Hotel and have dinner. And he was pulling in by the hill to make a U-turn by the Winchester Hotel, which at that time was a very elaborate, fine dining place. And there was Mrs. Roberts, who was the cook in this motel, and she was cooking dinner, getting it all prepared. Well, he started to make the U-turn, and he lost control of the car, and he started doing as Maude's father tried to do. He was pulling on the steering wheel and hollering, "Whoa, whoa," and he couldn't get the car stopped. But he crashed right through the dining room of the Winchester, breaking glass, knocking over chairs and tables, food scattered all over. And apparently, according to Hap, who was in there at the time eating, and Malachi didn't even bat an eye. He just looked at Mrs. Roberts and says, "I just thought I'd drop in for dinner, Mrs. Roberts." Hap, in his many years in Phillip, recalls two of the most famous people he knows that came to Phillip. One in 1909, and that was Cahterine Nation, the famous women's prohibitionist. She came through on the train and was going to get off on the train at a rest stop, and she noticed that one of the first things she saw was the 73 bar. And she saw some men hanging around the 73 bar, and some of them were in a slight case of inebriation, apparently. and she decided that she was going to take matters into her own hands and took an axe and went into the bar and proceeded to wreak havoc with the bar. And Evelyn's father has a picture, took a picture of Carrie in a very heavy black dress, a picture of her right on that street. And he says that was one of the more famous people, but yeah, you might say infamous, I don't know. But anyway, Carrie tried to do her part and keep Philip a respectable town by wrecking the bar. In 1927, President Coolidge came through Philip on a train. The train slowed to when he realized he was coming to a town, why the train slowed, and he got on the platform and he waved to the crowds, and apparently there were some things thrown off to the kids, and Hap remembers seeing this, and people had advance notice that Mr. Coolidge was coming through town. He was going to the Summer White House in the Black Hills, and which is the location where he made his famous "I do not choose to run" speech. But Hap is just sure that he was coming through Philip, and realizing what kind of town Philip was, that he decided he didn't want to be president anymore of a country that had towns like Philip. He meant that in jest, of course. And this doesn't have to do with Hap Dorothy, but it has to do with another famous Philip resident, and that being Mr. Ted Becker, the barber. Ted has an interesting story of how he came to Philip. He came through Philip in 1927 on the train on his way to Rapid City. He was going to work he was just fresh out of barber college and all set to go off and make his mark in the world as a barber, and he was going to do it in Rapid City. And he came through, and he had to spend the night in Philip at the Seneschal Hotel, and the next day he had to wait for the train, and he wandered downtown to see what the barber shop was like. Well, he got in the barber shop and he didn't like what he saw. He decided, well, I think I can do just as well, and so he thought, well, I think I'll stick on here for a few days and see if I can help this guy out. And I spoke to him the other day. This is 55 years later, and I said, well, Ted, did you ever decide that you wanted to stay in Philip? And he says, well, I don't know. Let me think about it for a while. I haven't really made up my mind. And as I say, it could go on for quite a while with many of the stories that Hap had to say, but as I say, time doesn't permit it. So that's Hap's story right there. Thank you very much.
If you were courting, it was important that you make the best first impression possible. And if you felt help was needed, why, you just called upon your neighbors. And such was the case in John Burns's neighborhood. John had a bachelor friend who had a young lady to impress, and he called upon John to assist and give final approval. The young man in question was not worldly and had little time for fashion gazing, so John decided he would help with the dressing process. He'd give him his stamp of approval. Looked at his hair, it was okay, the shave, suit, the shoes, but alas, the devil grabbed hold of John when his eyes reached the tie. John said to his friend, who had his tie positioned in the usual spot, John said, "That'll never do. No, sir, it'll never do. You're sure to lose this young lady if you leave the house dressed like that with the tie where you have it. I know you haven't been out much, you haven't seen much, but the new style these days is to take that tie and you tie it under your left ear." So the change was made, and the grateful friend rode off to pursue his romantic interest.
Well, I have something a little different. I got a murder story for you. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Mexican Ed, but he was probably the first person who ever homesteaded in this area. He homesteaded on the quarter section where the Grindstone Hall is and where the old buildings are. And he homesteaded there in 1892, and he is thought to have been living there 15 years before that. The Deadwood Trail, probably some of you know, goes through there and crosses North Fork right there. Mexican Ed, his real name was Edward Sanchez, and he carried mail for a while from Grindstone to Pedro. Only Grindstone post office was not there then. In fact, it was down at our place, the Shoemaker Ranch, and my father was the postmaster. Mexican Ed had a few cattle, and then his main business, I suppose you could say, was he ran a roadhouse there. And the roadhouses in those days, they furnished bed and board and shelter and feed for the horses. So he probably had a pretty good business there. But of course that was before homestead days. Now this story is in 1902. People didn't know really anything about Mexican Ed. In those days, you know, you didn't ask questions, and that's one thing the TV shows are right about. In those days, you didn't get too curious. It didn't always pay to ask people too many questions. So nobody knew much about Mexican Ed, but he had to be a United States citizen or he couldn't have homesteaded. That we should know. Anyway, one day, two cowpunchers rode in, Alec Meader and Bob Adams, and they stopped. I don't know about the story, whether they had a meal or not, but anyway, they played poker with Mexican Ed, and they got into some kind of a fuss. So they got up to leave, and they went out to mount their horses and leave, and Bob Adams noticed that he had left his overshoes. So he went back, and when he got to the door, Mexican Ed came out with a gun. This is Adams' story, of course, because Ed wasn't able to tell a story about it. Anyway, he said he says, I shot him in self-defense. So they killed him right then. There's Adams killed him. And then they came on down to our place where my father was. That's about 3 miles. And the fellow says, I'd like to tell you that I just killed Mexican Ed. Can you imagine how my father felt? And Mexican Ed was well liked by the neighbors around, and some of the neighbors were Karstensons, Jensens, Shoemakers, and Thorsons. And so the fellow said, well, we'd like to have you go along up there to see how it is and take care of the body. So my dad mounted a horse, and they went up there, and he said, sure enough, it was like he said, Mexican Ed lay with a bullet between the eyes. And there was another neighbor who lived over where McClure's place is now. His name was Tom O'Brien, so the two of them took the responsibility. Well, these fellows then, they rode on, came on down North Fork, and there was a dance going on down, somebody else mentioned the Morrison place down east of Philipton. There was a lively dance going on there. So during a lull in it, Bob Adams got up and told him that he'd just killed Mexican Ed and that he was going to Fort Pierre to give himself up. Well, people didn't make too much of things like that then. They thought it wasn't any of their business. And so he went on, and this was in February 1902. And then later on, he came back out this way, and he was bragging about how he killed Mexican Ed and so forth, and he said they ought to have a bounty on greasers. Well, this made Ed's friends real sore about it, and so they went together and they got him arrested. And this was in July, and they had the trial, and the judge sentenced him to 7 years of hard labor in the penitentiary, and he was taken down there right away. And Mexican Ed's body, this O'Brien took it to Fort Pierre, and it's buried in the old cemetery at Fort Pierre. It's up on a hill there, northwest of Fort Pierre. That's the story of Mexican Ed.
Thank you very much for coming.